Alright, we are back with a new video, and we are back updating the Amazing Race 34 Power Rankings following episode 2, and it's kind of similar to episode 1. This was a pretty up and down leg for a lot of it, where there was quite a bit of placement changes, a lot of pretty massive swings as well. But I will admit that at this point, we are starting to get a better sense of how these teams are going to do over the course of the entire race, so I feel like through that kind of solidifies things to a degree. But with that said, there are 11 teams to rank here, and let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 11, we have the boots from this week, and here we have Tim and Rex. And I kind of expected them to be early boots here, as I never had that much confidence in them as racers. Now mind you, I did kind of get surprised by how it happened, where they actually got relatively far ahead early on, being the third ones to arrive at the roadblock, but then they just completely sucked at it, where they just kept trying to yodel over and over, kept screwing it up to the point where all these teams passed them by. And obviously they got to the detour as well. They chose the Bells one, where they just completely sucked at that as well. And it's kind of crazy how they went from third place at the start of the leg to out of the race by the end of it. And considering how fun of characters they were as well, they are a pretty big loss here. But with that said, I was expecting them to not do super well here. So because of that, they are here at number 11. And with that, there are 10 teams left in the race. And as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely it is that they'll win the race from this point based on their current race ability. But at number 10, and really these bottom two were kind of interchangeable, as I feel like they've both been pretty far back for the first stretch of the race here. And I don't have too much confidence in them to bounce back. But at number 10, I did decide to go with Aubrey and David here. And really, I feel like a lot of this comes down to their average placement. I feel like they have been more consistently behind than all the other teams in the race so far, with them obviously being second to last on the first leg here. And even here, now getting only an 8th place finish. Now, I will give them some credit. They did do pretty well at the detour. They really highlighted their abilities there during the dancing one. But even so, I didn't have too much faith in them either way. They obviously struggled quite a bit during the roadblock, and they kind of got a bit lost as well during the navigation to the detour that caused them to, again, drop a spot there. And really, I don't have too much evidence that they are great racers, and I feel like considering the competition so far, I don't really have too much faith in them to do well moving forward. Now, is it possible for them to make a bounce back? Absolutely. But I feel like based on what we saw from them over the first 2 legs, I don't feel like it's looking too great for them right now. And because of that, they are here at number 10. Now I'm moving on to number 9, and I feel like this one is pretty close as well. However, I did decide to give them a bump up this week, but here we have Rich and Dom. And really the main reason I have them higher than Aubrey and David is because of their performance in the first leg. I feel like they did a bit better through that, to where they are arguably more consistent throughout these first 2 weeks. Even though I feel like on this slate, they technically performed worse than Aubrey and David, where obviously they did okay at the roadblock, but then after they got to the detour, they just kind of dropped the ball there, to where they actually dropped to 9th place, 1 spot below Aubrey and David there. So through that, I don't feel that confident that they'll do well either, and considering the fact that they did worse on this individual leg than Aubrey and David did, I did consider putting them 1 spot lower. However, I did decide to put them above them simply because I felt like their performance in the first leg was better than Aubrey and David's first leg was, to where I feel like Rich and Dom will be a slightly more consistent team than Aubrey and David. But at the end of the day, they're both in a pretty bad spot. They're both in the back of the pack, and they haven't done too much to show their ability to move forward. So because of that, I have them here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we, again, have another team that I haven't been too impressed by so far. However, they technically did considerably better than the next couple teams we'll be talking about. But here we have Luis and Michelle here, and obviously they had a relatively strong leg here, getting a 5th place finish. Mind you, I feel like a lot of that stemmed from the detour and the fact that they were already dancers, which allowed them to basically breeze through the detour to get to that 5th place finish. Although to be fair, they did also do okay at the roadblock as well, so at least there's that. But similar to the last 2 teams we talked about, I don't feel too confident in Luis and Michelle moving forward. And yes, while they did leapfrog quite a few teams to get to 5th place here, I feel like a lot of that was due to these tasks in this leg being pretty favorable to their skill set. Whereas I'm not entirely sure how they're going to do moving forward on other tasks that may not favor that skill set. So I can't have them too much higher here, although it would be interesting to see them make a comeback here. But for now, I did decide to leave them here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and I kind of debated this placement here as, on one hand, I feel like this is a mostly middling team and one that hasn't really impressed me too much, but I also feel like they have the potential to have an interesting run here based on the edit. But here we have Emily and Molly, and I feel like the main reason I had them this high is I feel like they at least have the potential story of them being these long lost twins that could use the race in order to bond and to make up for lost time. And I feel like that's at least a storyline that could propel them towards a deep run here. Now, I should clarify that I don't really factor the edit too much into my Amazing Race rankings, as I feel like Amazing Race doesn't quite use the same editing tricks that Survivor does in order to foretell who's going to make a deep run. And I feel like through that, it's kind of hard to judge how well someone's going to do based solely on the edit. And through that, I feel like I had to base it more on what we're seeing on the race here. But with that said, I still feel like edit can be used to some extent here, which is something that I feel like could help Emily and Molly here. Now, with that said, I feel like their performance on the race is fine. I mean, they have been consistently in the middle of the pack. Mind you, this particular leg wasn't that great for them, where despite them like coming in 5th place at the end of the last leg, they kind of do okay at the roadblock, but then they just kind of go downhill a bit during the detour, causing them to fall to 7th place here. So not an overly impressive leg for me. And unlike some other teams on the race, some of which we'll be talking about soon, I feel like Molly probably won't improve as much as those other teams as they become more acclimated to the race itself. And as they start to work better as a team, I feel like what we're seeing from Emily and Molly is largely what we're going to be getting from them from this point forward. Now, obviously, I could be wrong, of course, but I feel like just based on what we're seeing so far, I'm not too impressed by them, and because of that, I can't have them any higher than number 7 here. Now, moving on to number 6, and I feel like this team is kind of an example of what I'm talking about in terms of a team that I feel like will do better as the race goes along. But here we have Abby and Will here, and I know that they've kind of underperformed so far through these first 2 legs, and even this past leg for them wasn't that great for them getting a 6th place finish. However, I feel like they're still a team that has a lot of potential to improve over the course of the race. Now, obviously, they had a pretty rocky first leg where it was mostly downhill for them, but I feel like this second leg was definitely an improvement where they obviously did really well at the roadblock, jumping from 9th place all the way to 5th place by the end of that. And they even got a head start to the detour, jumping it to 4th place there. Now, obviously, they did kind of struggle a bit on the detour, causing it to jump down to 6th place, which is where they finished at the end of the leg. But I still feel like they're a team that is getting more comfortable with working together and working together on the race. And I feel like that through that, they still are a team I have some confidence in making a deep run. Now, obviously, the teams above them have shown more evidence of them doing well so far, and through that, more evidence that they'll continue to do well over the course of the race. But I still feel good enough about Abby and Will to where I have them decently high considering their placements, but it's still only enough for them to be a number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and I'm sure some people will feel like this team is a bit too high on the list considering how disastrous of a leg they had here. However, I still was kind of impressed by how they did by the end of it, but here we have Quinton and Mattie here, and obviously we have to talk about the fact that they got lost early on in the leg. They didn't know that Innsbruck was in Austria instead of Germany, and through that they fell really far behind, going from 3rd place all the way down to last place, and it really felt like for a lot of it that they're probably going to be out of it, and arguably they probably would have been out of the race if Tim and Rex hadn't sucked so much at the actual tasks. Now, with that said, once they did get to the actual task, they did really well, breezing through the roadblock without too much difficulty. And obviously, when they got to the detour, they did just enough to leapfrog Tim and Rex to ultimately scrape on by with a second to last finish here. Now, again, I do feel like they still got very lucky with Tim and Rex doing so poorly on the tasks here. But still, I find the fact that Quinton and Mattie were able to recover from what should have been an insurmountable obstacle for them, what should have been them probably being eliminated, into something that allowed them to survive here. And yes, while it is on the back of mistakes of others, I still feel like Quinton and Mattie were able to do pretty well at the tasks that allowed them to come back. And moving forward, I still feel like they'll probably learn from this and probably bounce back as a result. Now, obviously, the fact that they made the mistake to begin with is a pretty big knock and could come back to bite them later on in the race, especially given that it was a navigation based one. But all things considered, I still feel like they're a team that could do well moving forward. So because of that, they're here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and I feel like this team has been pretty solid through the first 2 legs here. Although I still feel like a lot of the story is being propped up by the edit to a degree. But here we have Linton and Sharik here. And again, I feel like they're doing pretty well so far. I mean, obviously they got a 4th place finish on the first leg, and now they got a 3rd place finish. I feel like they are one of the more consistent teams over these first couple of legs here. And also I feel like their storyline has been propped up through the edit, where I felt like coming in, they probably could have fallen for the trap of father and daughter teams like getting into arguments and not working super well together. But really, we have seen them work pretty well together so far, which does impress me to a great degree here. Now, obviously, the fact that they are being propped up so much does make me wonder whether they'll actually win or if they'll just make a deep run and just be here more for the experience than anything else. But still, the fact that they had the results to back up their performance, again, 4th place finish, first leg, 3rd place finish, second leg, is enough to have them at least this high on the list. Although I feel like the top 3 teams are also pretty consistent, but also teams that I feel like will do pretty well moving forward. So because of that, they are here at number 4 here. Now moving on to number 3, and I feel like this is a team that is largely here because of their performance so far. And believe it or not, they are actually the team with the highest average through the first 2 legs up to this point. But here we have Glenda and Lumumba here getting their second place finish in a row. And that alone has to be commemorated. I mean, the fact that they have been so consistent throughout the course of the race so far, and on this leg, they never fell below 4th place at any point, where obviously they were a bit slow getting to the roadblock, but again, they did very well at the roadblock, and they did pretty well at the detour as well, that allowed them to remain pretty steady throughout this leg. And again, similar to other teams we already talked about, I feel like they're a team that is getting more comfortable as the race goes along, and through that, I feel like they'll probably continue to do well. Now, obviously, they're probably not my normal pick for who I think would do well in the Amazing Race, but again, the evidence backs it up so far, and that is a big reason that they are at least this high. But I feel like the top 2 teams have been a bit more impressive, and teams I feel like seem a bit more consistent so far, at least on paper. So because of that, I did have to leave them here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and this is another team that I really debated on, as on one hand, I do feel like they are a pretty good team for the most part, and a team that will probably continue to do well moving forward. But on the other hand, they do have some shortcomings, such as what we saw on this leg. But here we have Derek and Claire, and it's kind of tough for me because on one hand, I can't ignore how strong their first leg was, where they were very consistently in the front of the pack for a lot of that. And through that, they ended up winning their first leg. And I felt like coming into week 2 that they were the most consistent team coming into the race. But then at the start of the second leg, we see Claire really struggle with the roadblock here, dropping all the way down to 10th place, second to last. And obviously that's really, really bad that they ran into a task that they had a lot of trouble with. But then after the roadblock, they made a really crazy comeback again, where they were able to race to the detour, race through the bells, and ended up still getting a 4th place finish, despite how bad they did at the roadblock. And I feel like even though they had that lower low, the fact that they were able to make that comeback is really, really impressive to me, and really highlights their ability to bounce back from tough circumstances. Now, obviously, the fact that they made that mistake at all is still not great, and again, there could be other tasks in the future where they struggle a lot at. But considering the evidence that we have of them so far, with their really strong first leg and their really remarkable comeback on the second leg here, I still feel like they're going to be a very strong team moving forward, and through that, I feel very impressed by them. But again, I feel like the number 1 team is a bit more strong through their first 2 legs, and a team that didn't make as many big mistakes as Derek and Claire did, or even Quinton and Mattie. So because of that, I did have to leave Derek and Claire here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the team that I believe is the most likely to win the Amazing Race 34 right now is Marcus and Michael. And it's sort of weird because if you look at their track record up to this point, they obviously still have some mistakes. I mean, a lot of it stems from their first leg, where they really had that downward trajectory in the back half of it, where despite them being in the front of the pack for a lot of that first leg, they ended up struggling at the third challenge that caused them to fall to sixth place in the first place. And to me, obviously, that's a knock, and one reason why one would drop them lower than what we had so far. But considering that other teams up to this point have had their low points, with Derek and Claire obviously having the roadblock from this episode, even Glenda and Lumumba didn't do that great right out of the gate. I mean, we see Marcus and Michael do pretty well on most tasks here. And in this leg, they really do well here, where obviously they race at a roadblock despite being the 16 to leave, and they ultimately come out in the front of the pack in the roadblock and basically hold that lead for the rest of the leg. They win this leg here. And yes, while other teams like Glenda and Lumumba have a, again, pretty consistent finish as well, Linton and Sharik are also a pretty consistent team. Also, I feel like Marcus and Michael are probably pretty well built to continue to do well over the course of the race here. And yes, while they have shown evidence of them slipping behind early on, they didn't make as big of a mistake as, say, Derek and Claire did in terms of them really causing the roadblock to cause them to fall that far behind. Marcus and Michael, I feel like, are teams that will continue to do well over the course of the race, and they are a team that I feel like can win the race from this point on. Now, again, it's still very early. I mean, we still only have 2 legs to work with here, and a lot can change between now and then. But I feel like based on everything we've seen so far, based on their background, but also their ability to recover from tough circumstances and their ability to dominate the early stretches of the race, I feel like Marcus and Michael are the team that I had the most confidence in right now. And it's because of that I had them here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it really helps out with the channel. Now, I'll be continuing with my Amazing Race coverage next week once the next leg happens, so stay tuned for that. I also have Survivor 43 coverage happening right now, as that season is also playing out. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server. I'll leave a link to join in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that's the video. See ya.